and welcome back to the Sheldon Show. So today is going to be part 3 of the ongoing series that I recently started, which has to do with how we can live a better life. And so far I've talked about cognitive deficit thinking, and if you haven't seen that video as yet, you can go back and look at that. And then I've also talked about why is it that we need to love ourselves and what that is. I've talked about self-acceptance and tried to differentiate that from settling. And then I also talked about self-worth and then why you need to set or have boundaries. So today I'm going to talk about self-responsibility, right? This whole idea of being responsible for our own actions and why that is necessary if you want to have or want to live a good life. So that's something I want to talk about today. And that's the whole idea of what is self-responsibility, why is it important, and then a couple other things to go along with that. So when I think of self-responsibility, I think of owning up to whatever, right? Whatever that is. But taking ownership of things that we have done. And whether that is something that's good or whether it's something that is negative. And negative sometimes is a good thing. It just kind of depends on how you look at it. Not because something is perhaps you could say negative, it means that it's necessarily all bad. And then a lot of times we can learn from stuff that is negative or stuff that perhaps it wasn't our best moment, right? But we own up to the fact that we did it, it is whatever it is, or that I made these mistakes in life, as we all have. We've all made mistakes. But I think the key thing is, and when I was making notes on this whole topic, one of the things that I actually wrote down was to take notes. And that's kind of how I look at the whole idea of self-responsibility. To me, it's about reflection. And when you're reflecting, you want to take notes, right? Mental notes, perhaps. You don't always have to write stuff down. But mental notes of why am I in the position that I am in now? How did I get here? What are the things that I did to contribute to me being here? So many times you would hear people say, you might hear someone who's in a bad relationship complain about the person that they're in the relationship with, and you know, go on and on and on about how the person is bad, and the person may not be, you know, perfect, so to speak. They may have made a ton of mistakes. But often what you don't hear sometimes in situations like that is when the person takes ownership of the things that they have done to help contribute to the relationship being bad. Or just the fact that they are in a relationship with the person in the first place, right? And taking ownership for the fact that maybe they overlooked certain things and they're the ones who are also partially responsible for having themselves in the situations that they're in. So, 1, take notes as far as self-responsibility is concerned. 2, reflection. What comes to my mind every time I think of self-responsibility is Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror. That's the song, to me, it is one of the most powerful songs. And simply for that reason, a lot of times the things that we are going through, the difficulties that we're facing in our lives, has to do with the decisions that we have made, right? And growing up, my grandmother would always say, you know, the way you make your bed, so you're going to lie in it. And I'm sure that you've all probably heard that. But I think Michael Jackson's The Man in the Mirror is really critical. If you listen to that song, you look at the lyrics, it is about reflecting. It is about really taking into consideration that if you really, truly want to change your circumstances, the best place to start is to start looking at yourself, to try really and dissect what is it that's not working and how am I contributing to the things that are not working, instead of just being critical of everybody else and not being critical of yourself. So self-reflection, definitely good, and always you've got to look in the mirror. So I think another thing is we also have to realize that for the most part, right? For the most part, and there are always circumstances, and there's always the extreme, or there's always the outlier, or whatever the case is, but for the most part, all of us are where we are today because we put ourselves in that situation. Now, there are a lot of times forces that we cannot control, right? There are things that we cannot control in our lives. There are circumstances that come up that cause us to find ourselves in certain situations or certain circumstances. But the reason why I don't want you to get too comfortable always trying to identify what may have caused me to be here in terms of looking at the circumstances or the people, right, that may have caused me to be living the life that I'm living right now. The reason why I don't want you to get too comfortable always trying to identify those is because you're looking for solutions, I think, a lot of times in the wrong places. Now, yes, you may need to cut some people out of your life. Yes, you may need to change your circumstances or your environment, stuff like that I've already discussed. But then you've got to, what did I do, right? There's got to be some self-responsibility. So what I'm trying to say is to stop pointing fingers all the time, trying to point out who is responsible for where you are and take some ownership of the fact that you have a lot to do with where you are. So if you're in a relationship right now and it's not working, it's abusive, or it could be mentally or physically, verbally, or it's just a bad relationship, or the person that you're in a relationship with is not contributing anything, well, you can't really be blaming a whole lot of people. You've got to take responsibility for that. And if anyone is going to really change that situation, it has to be you, all right? So taking acceptance of the decisions that you have made, and I talked about acceptance in the video where I was talking about the idea of loving yourself and all that type of stuff. So you've got to take acceptance of the fact that you've done things to be where you are today. Whether good or bad, you've contributed to those things. Whether it's 60 or 40% of it or whatever, but you have contributed to it. So stop blaming everyone a lot of times for stuff, because when we do that is we deflect from the fact that we are a cause of our own worst nightmares. A lot of us have put ourselves in the situations that we're in, and the only way we're going to get out of those situations is if a lot of times we just stop blaming everyone else and just take ownership of the things that we've done and then try to turn that around. So we've got to own up to we've got to own up to the mistakes that we've made, and we've got to realize that we've all been dealt a certain stack or a certain deck of cards or whatever the case is. But then you've got to decide how you're going to play them and how you're going to move from that point. After you have a series of cards in your hands, it's up to you how you play those cards going forward, right? So responsibility, I think, when you take responsibility, what that does is it leads to realization, right? Taking responsibility leads to realization. The realization that is, this is my situation, this is what I'm in right now, this is how I got myself here, this is what I've done to get in this situation, and now I need to get out of it. But the first thing is taking responsibility. So responsibility, don't forget this, responsibility leads to realization. When you take responsibility, then you really start to realize just how much you've perhaps contributed to whatever circumstances or situations that you're going through. Now, after you have gotten to the point of where there is realization, then you could start making changes. You can start coming up with your plan now. After you realize what you've done, you can start coming up with your plan to make changes to get out of the situation that you are in, right? So it is very difficult, though, to have long-lasting changes that will stick, so to speak, if you are not operating in reality, right? So you've got to be operating in a sense of reality. If you're going to make changes that are going to stick, if you're operating in some alternative universe, so to speak, then and not dealing with life or the situation as it is, then it is very likely that whatever changes that you make, that they're perhaps not going to stick, right? So for me, and I wrote down this definition of reality as I was going through this, and I kind of want to read it back. To me, this is my definition of reality. Reality is the act of living in one's conscious space, right? So I'll repeat that. Reality is the act of living in one's conscious space. So let me explain that. What is your conscious space? Well, I use the word conscious because conscious means that you are aware, right? So you've taken responsibility for your actions, which means you've gotten to the point of realization. And so now you are aware, very much aware, of how you have ended up in whatever predicament that you've ended up in. You're very consciously aware of that, which means you're mindful of it. And to be able to make change when it comes to anything, one of the things is you got to be mindful. So you're consciously aware of what's going on, and you're aware of your space. Your space is your life. Your space is your car. Your space is your house. Your space is your bedroom. Your space is your space. You're consciously aware of what is going on around you. You're consciously aware of how your life is unfolding, right? So that's why that's my definition of reality. Reality is the act of living in one's own conscious space. So are you living in your conscious space, which means are you really living in reality? Are you really dealing with things from a reality perspective, so to speak, a realization that this is truly how life is for me? And if you're not being real with yourself, so to speak, then that is something that you definitely need to address, because then you're not going to be able to live that good life that we're talking about, right? If you're operating in that that alternative universe, so to speak, right? So that is what I wanted to talk about today as the next phase in living that good life, and that's self-responsibility. It's you taking ownership of your actions, taking ownership of the decisions and the choices that you've made in your life. Realizing that although a lot of those choices and decisions and whatever may have been influenced or impacted by a lot of times by outside forces, at the end of the day, if you never take ownership, then you're never operating in that place where you're in that realization stage, right? Where you're operating in your conscious space, where you're dealing with things as they stand and not as you would like them to be, right? And that's a big difference. Are you dealing with things as they stand? Are you seeing things for where they are? Or are you making up a relationship that doesn't exist? And that's something that I've talked to a lot of people about, relationships or whatever the case is, done a lot of my own research. And a lot of times people are talking about the relationship that they wish they had, not that the one that they're in. And they're looking for solutions for the one that they wish they had. Well, you don't have it. So if you're coming up with solutions for something you wish you had, maybe that's for something in the future. But you need solutions for what is it that you have right now. So make sure that you're operating and you're living in your own conscious space. You're dealing with reality. So don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to leave your comments. And this is part 3 of the ongoing series, How to Live a Better Life, as I'm giving you these tips. And I look forward to your comments, because that I'm able to learn from your comments as well. And I can adapt and include things in other videos that I'll do going forward, or even do a follow-up to this video. So thank you again for joining me here at The Sheldon Show. I'm looking forward to your comments and your feedback, and I'll see you again for part 4. Thank you for joining me today.